So welcome everyone. Tonight's topic is the recent Chinese spy balloon incident. And there was one of them. We heard about three under a previous administration and one previously under the current administration. There wasn't a lot of discussion about those back then. NORAD actually did detect them, but it was a nothing burger. But for various political and media FUD, this one was big time. So lots of stuff to talk about that one. And then there was another one yesterday. And then in Canada, there was another one today. So, NORAD said, expect more. So some people might think this is not a pertinent topic for an astronomy group, but two reasons. One is they actually use high altitude balloons to carry aloft telescopes in the Antarctic to do observing. So that was a crossover that I thought it'd be interesting to understand how all this stuff works and the history of it and how long these things have been happening. Plus, I always like mitigating FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, because the media likes to churn it so much. So part of this will be stuff you may not have known, but once you know, it's like, I learned not to fear the bomb. Okay, why would you use balloons when satellites exist? All the major nations, US, China, Russia, all have orbiting surveillance satellites. And the picture here showing all the missiles, that's just the no longer classified spy satellites that the US had, or still has. Some of them have burned up. Some of them are still up there, but we don't use them anymore. They're shut down. And some of them are up there and are still in use. Does anybody recognize the one that's in the lower right-hand corner? The one that looks like a lot like the Hubble Space Telescope? That's a KH-11, folks. And yeah, maybe there were some similarities. Maybe that's why the mirror didn't work too well, because pointing down is a different focal length and, focus than pointing to deep space. Anyway, so if you're lucky enough to be near one, you will see these government military installations with all the giant golf balls. The giant golf balls are actually radio antenna domes or radar domes that they use so that the dish can keep rotating even if there's snow outside, because sometimes you want to put these where the snow is, like above the dew line, so to speak. So if you want to use a satellite, that works really well. What if there's clouds in the way? What if the radio frequency you want to monitor does not penetrate the Earth's atmosphere? Well, maybe you want to get lower, but I heard from Malcolm Nance that another reason why China may be resorting to satellites is, resorting to balloons, is the cameras on their satellites and the lenses aren't in the same quality level as the US, and therefore maybe that's why balloons work better for them, because you can get closer to your target. Don't know. That's just a supposition on his part. But why use a balloon when you can use aircraft? Aircraft can fly higher or lower than a helium-filled balloon. And we've had surveillance aircraft for a long time, and nobody has copied the SR-71 yet. But China does have a clone of an earlier version of the U-2 spy plane. We've used them for surveillance. The latest one is the one down at the bottom, the RQ-4 Global Hawk. They had one of those out in California when Helen was out looking at Sophia, and just ignore the top secret spy plane in the back of the hangar. The U-2 and the SR-71, pilots on board. Now, how long can they fly? Well, until you wear out the pilot and you can refuel them in flight, but after the second refueling, the awakeness of the pilot starts to become a problem. And while the SR-71 does have a two-pilot version, I think the U-2 is only a single-pilot version. So the Global Hawk, they got rid of the weakest link, got rid of the pilot. In fact, there's not even folks on the ground that steer this plane. You tell it where you want it to go, what you want it to do, what you want it to capture. It's fully autonomous. It takes off, flies to the destination, can even in mid-flight refuel more than once, does its job, and then flies home. So yeah, we use aircraft occasionally. We're very fond of using things like a Global Hawk if there happens to be a war or some skirmish that arises in some other country, and we will send a Global Hawk over there. They can fold up and fit inside of a C-130 cargo carrier, so you can actually fly it to its destination, roll it out, have it, pop out the wings and take off and go do its thing, and then fly it back home. Some aspects of a balloon are better. If you're flying a supersonic aircraft, there's only so slow you can go. So you fly over an area rather quickly. But with a balloon, since it's in the Gulf Stream, if the Gulf Stream is kind of lax, the balloon can do what they refer to as loiter. It can linger, it can hang around for a while and shoot picture after picture after picture, or gather radio signals, what is known as signals intelligence, or SIGINT. And around the US, for meteorological weather forecasting purposes, they launch, I think it's over 1,000, I think it's closer to 1,100, just typical cheap helium-filled or hydrogen-filled, because that's even cheaper, balloons for weather observation purposes every day of the week, even on the weekends, just to monitor the weather. The balloons themselves are typically lost. They'll go up, do their weather monitoring, and then they'll actually tell the radio sonde package, cut the balloon loose, and then they'll come down by a parachute, and it has a please return to mailing envelope address. And some people return them. Sometimes they get lost out in the wilderness and are never seen again, but they like to recover them and reuse them. I think there's somewhere a couple of $100 a piece for the radio sonde equipment, because they have to make so many of them, the cost gets to be less. But yeah, we've been doing that for a long time. This was interesting to research. During World War II, the island nation of Japan would send hydrogen-filled balloons on the jet stream, and as the jet stream would dip down, the balloon would either drop its payload or the balloon would eventually burst and it would fall to the ground and would not detonate. It waited until it had like a mercury sensor thing in it. It would wait until somebody jostled it, and then it would detonate. Nasty stuff. It didn't wipe out any towns or anything like that, like the Japanese had expected, but it did kill a couple of people. Somebody had mentioned, why don't you have these things carry propaganda leaflets? The problem is they fly so high that if you had them released to propaganda leaflets at 40,000 feet, the number of leaflets per square area would be very, very small because it'd be scattered by the jet stream. In order for a balloon to carry all the different stuff that it needs to carry, it needs to have a fairly sturdy undercarriage. And if you look at this picture, you see in the center, the white thing, that's a parabolic dish antenna. And if you look at to the right of the circular black thing at the center, you'll see what looks like a bunch of small white things. Those are also parabolic dish antennas pointing down. So you have one dish antenna pointing sideways, that's your satellite relay. And then you have a bunch of them pointing down, because from 60,000+ feet, that's how you pick up your signals intelligence of the stuff on the ground. Plus, if you have any mesh or plate antenna there in the center, any cameras, they're going to take up space. As usual, batteries are heavy, so all those little square things, those are not for signals intelligence. Those are not antennas. Those are solar cells. Those are solar panels for generating electricity, because the solar panels can be lighter than the batteries that they charge. And if you're going to be flying it in the daytime, it's okay for you to shut it down at night so you don't need that much battery power. So it was only observing probably during the daytime. And how can you tell this? Because of the number of solar panels it has. If you're driving along the highway and you see a sign alongside the road and you see a couple of solar panels and a box with a battery in it, there's no electrical connection to that sign, and that sign might, blink or say something different or be radio connected. And it doesn't take much. These are fairly, from 65,000 feet, being able to see these panels, those panels are probably 4 feet by 8 feet each. That's a lot of solar array. Also think of it as, where's the sun? The sun's pretty much above the balloon. So it's getting a lot of its light indirectly, which means you need more panels. So they were trying to estimate if these were typical, commercially available Chinese solar panels, then this thing was generating about 12 kilowatts worth of power. That is a lot of power for the surveillance equipment. So it was very interesting for U.S. national security agencies to uncover what kind of equipment was this? Why did it require so much power? I'm thinking the reason why it required so much photoelectric array is because the arrays are on the bottom of the balloon. Look at this picture. Where's the sunlight? It's off onto the side of the sphere of the balloon. There's not much light on the bottom. If the balloon is in the jet stream, how do you rotate the balloon? If you have inertial management on board, you could have some gyroscopes that even though the wind is blowing, the balloon is circular, so is spherical, so you can have it rotate the balloon to better get it fixed by either the sunlight on the solar panels or by the radio antenna pointing to satellite. Think of the satellite. What kind of satellites would it be? Think about the angle of the dish. Think about where the satellite is. The satellite cannot be overhead because the truss, the boom on the bottom, did not extend all the way out to the side, and the parabolic dish antenna is pointing up. The parabolic dish antenna is pointing to the side, which means the satellite it might be talking to has to be low on the horizon. If you do some calculations, you'll find that over North and Central America, there are no Chinese spy satellites. Think about it for a moment. How would they get a signal back to China? Because China would be over the curvature of the Earth. And as we had mentioned during our discussion of the Deep Space Network, China does not have a fully 24/7 deep space network like the US does, because there are places on Earth that those nations won't let the Chinese put giant satellite ground stations. Canada, the US, Mexico, most of Central America, the northern countries of South America, they won't allow Chinese ground stations there. It's a government thing. So if they're flying a satellite over the US and they want to relay that to a satellite, it won't be to a satellite directly overhead. It'll have to be to a satellite low on the horizon. There's only two kinds that would be low on the horizon like that. One is a polar orbiting satellite, but if you're going to relay to it, you're not going to get much time on it because it's traveling 90 degrees to your direction of travel. So you only get 15 minutes worth of signal access, maybe 4 times a day. That's not much. What you want is to get one of the Chinese geostationary satellites that's over the equator, out over the Atlantic Ocean, because the Chinese satellites aren't allowed stations on the geostationary plane over Central and South America, because those are first priority reserved by the nations below them. So they have to take what they can get out over the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. So relay. So the balloon would have to relay to a Horizon satellite, geostationary, who would then relay to the only available Chinese station in South America, in the central part of Argentina. So, people are saying things like, well, when the balloon was over our missile silos, they were talking to them Chinese satellites. That's not really a possibility. They'd have to get out over the Atlantic, which is another reason why we shot it down before it got too far out over the Atlantic. So what about balloons that look up and not down? This is what I was referring to. Here you see one of the balloons that NASA sends up into a circular polar orbit over the South Pole so that we can do optical astronomy above the atmosphere of the Earth easily. Balloons compared to putting in an observatory in the Antarctic, because there's not a high enough mountain to do it. Plus, it's cold down there, and you don't have to maintain a facility down there. So you have the aircraft fly in giant tanks full of helium. You send in the Mylar balloon, and you have a launch crane, that's that gray spoolie thing in the center, that will slowly unfurl the balloon as the helium going in from the right side there fills the balloon. And you don't fill it completely on the ground. You fill it about 30% on the ground. And as the balloon rises and the air pressure is reduced, the balloon gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually, if you let it go too high, it'll pop. And you don't want it to pop when you have an expensive large-scale telescope hanging beneath it. So what you do is ballast. And how do you generate ballast in a balloon? If it's cold outside and you have a metal plate and you warm it up to just the right temperature, you can have the atmospheric cold air warm up just enough so that the ice crystals in the air melt and produce water, and you collect the water into a package in the bottom of your balloon, and it acts as ballast. I thought that was clever, these earthlings. So if you want a balloon to go around the South Pole for several months at a time, you put a ballast mechanism on it so it never goes high enough that it pops. And they got it to 40 kilometers or 130,000 feet, 24.6 miles. And then they let it just orbit the South Pole, and then they brought it down. And when I say they brought it down, they cut the payload loose from the balloon, and then, after letting more ballast collect so it brings it down lower, cut the balloon away, let the parachute open, and it brings it back down. And now you can, aside from a few, ice and water stuff in the telescope and electronics, you can refurbish it and reuse it. So cheap astronomy, relatively speaking. Now people say, well, I saw the balloon. It was flying a controlled path. The jet stream is a series of air currents, not one, but it should be the jet streams. The jet streams are a series of air currents. The Pacific Northwest generates a high pressure zone, and the colder air rises and goes northward and passes that over Alaska into Canada, and then it comes down as colder air because there's a low pressure zone over the central part of Canada where there's not much of anything except ice. And that makes the jet stream descend, and it descends. If you look at the purple, it's kind of the same course the balloon took. Now, what they found out was, remember me mentioning ballast and gyroscopes? That allows you to, with a certain degree of control, rotate, raise and lower, and push a little bit on the jet stream to navigate the balloon. So it was still within the jet stream. It was still doing roughly 100 plus miles an hour, but they could kind of navigate it, but it still had to stay within the jet stream, because the moment it left the jet stream, that sucker would rise up and pop. So keep it in the jet stream. And the jet stream itself changes shape different seasons of the year based upon that abnormally cold getting a little warmer. So the jet stream goes back up and comes back down. Here's the plotted path of that balloon. And if you remember, that jet stream looks pretty much the same. And what is the elevation of the jet stream at its core? As the balloon approached, 50,000 feet. As the balloon got to its maximum altitude, 70,000 feet. And then when it got to the warmer waters and ground towards the Atlantic Ocean, it descended down again. So the Defense Intelligence Agency knows about the jet streams, knows the path the balloon can take, and also knows from our own U.S. surveillance technology the level of control it has over its flight path. While the balloon was flying over the U.S., we actually had multiple U-2 flights. Now, apparently, the U.S. military, the U.S. Air Force, still has a few U-2s. The NASA organization for research has a couple of U-2s, but supposedly all the SR-71s have been decommissioned. They just cost too much to keep operational. But U-2s, yeah, we still use those. And U-2s can get high. So we used U-2s to surveil this balloon. It's not like
the ones used for research and also to test satellites, they renamed ER2s.
Yes, those are the ones that NASA has. The ones that the Air Force has are still called U-2s, but they're a particular model number of U-2 because they've improved them. They put money in them. They wouldn't put money in Sophia, but yeah. So how do we detect these balloons? NORAD, the North American Radar Aircraft Defense Command, that's been around since the early 50s. They're still out there. You used to know them as the Strategic Air Command, but that name went away, but NORAD is still out there. And NORAD is the guys that, get shipped north when they do things that their commanding officer doesn't like. I'm going to send you to Elmendorf. Elmendorf Air Force Base is just outside of Anchorage. Elmendorf is a joint Army Air Force base. The Air Force, I can understand. They've got planes up there. They've got radar installations up there. What's the Army doing up there? That's in case a foreign government thinks we're a good target for a troop invasion. So we keep an Army air base there. So that's Elmendorf-Richardson Joint Strategic Base is at Elmendorf. So they're always looking for stuff coming in, and the stuff they're looking for is typically missiles, but missiles can get stealthy, so they have all sorts of new technology for detecting them, and they can detect these balloons because the balloons, as you saw that big truss and the flat panels, radar reflects off of those things really good. So yeah, NORAD spotted these. So the NORAD radar picked up this balloon, relayed it to the appropriate security and surveillance branches of the U.S. government. They relayed that to the Department of Defense Joint Chiefs, who relayed that to the Department of Homeland Security, FBI, because it's counterintelligence, folks. So they all had this little turf war, and you can see it from the reporting structure. Who's going to get to do this? CIA, because it's foreign surveillance. Like, no, it's over U.S. territorial waters, so it's got to be the FBI. But the FBI doesn't have spy planes. that can go up there and surveil it, but the Air Force does. So, CIA gets access to the collected data, but the FBI is the driving counterintelligence. But it's the Air Force that's going to send something up and gather the data and then send it back to all the various departments. So that's what they did. And they were basically having fun with it. They knew what it was. They knew what its capabilities were. They knew, when it can phone home, when it can't. So they just used it as a target of education. What can the Chinese do? What kind of technologies do they have? And so they milked it for all they could. And once they couldn't get any more out of it before it could phone home, they took it down. So when you think we weren't doing anything, yeah, we were. So has this happened before? Yeah, just not with this level of FUD being prompted by the media and political leadership. But the 3 previous ones were over the core of the United States. And the one that was during an earlier part of this administration actually came in through the Gulf of Mexico and just briefly scalloped into South U.S. and then left. So not long enough for us to do much with it because it's traveling at 150 miles an hour in the Gulf streams. But they're apparently also sending them over Central and South America. The same time we were dealing with this one crossing the U.S., there was one in Mexico as well. My guess is they launched 2 of them close together, and the first one caught the jet stream and went over where they wanted it to, and the second one missed the jet stream and wound up over Mexico. But do we have things like this? Yeah. We've actually got a program called Cold Star. If you look at the Russian one, the Chinese one, it's just a sphere. That's because it's a takeoff on a giant meteorological balloon, because those are really cheap. The gray dirigible looking one is the US version of it. Yes, we have those things. And the latest project is called the DARPA Adaptable Lighter Than Air program, called ALTA. Or ALTA. Anyway, our balloon is a little more secretive. Our balloon is coated with radar reflective material, and it's shaped to be more aerodynamic. And we have the ballast mechanisms and the gyroscopes for steering it, so we can actually do it better. But think about it this way. If we wanted to surveil China and the jet stream is going west to east, where would we have to launch our balloon from? Northern Europe, probably Finland, because that's the only way we could get that to go over. Oh, we'd have to go over Russia, then China. And then we'd pick it up, once it got back to Alaska. But we fly ours at 90,000 feet. So a little more control. And that's well above the altitude of most fighters. And as we know from SR-71s, that's well above the altitude of most missiles. And since we coat it with something that reflects off the radiation, it makes it harder for, except the latest photographic heat-seeking lock-on missiles, to shoot it down if you're just looking for heat. So, yeah, we got better stuff. Do we use it? I don't know. Maybe someday we'll find out. So we detected this thing. What are we going to do with it? Well, unbeknownst to the general public, we were observing it, monitoring it, evaluating it, and early on they realized doesn't seem to be anything that could go boom on it. They found out later when it fell into the ocean that it did have a self-destruct detonation package on it, which was just small enough to destroy the electronics, because if they put a big bomb on it, that would have weighed it down. So no big bomb. Well, big bada boom. So we did all the surveillance we wanted, and then when it got out over, beyond the land line of South Carolina, when it was over the 12-mile limit of the U.S. waters before it got into international waters, then's when we shot it down. But, we're not, it's not going to be like we send up a mosquito to take out a balloon and pop it. No. We're going to use it for educational purposes again. So this is the Dragon lady. It's an Air Force U2S, and we actually used 2 of them. And I found out we have 31 of these U2s in the Air Force's inventory. So we think about, NASA has like 2 ER2s. Like, well, that's because we didn't need them anymore. They were the older models. We upgraded them. Now, if you see the picture down there at the bottom, the bump on the top, the U2 is live communicating with satellites overhead. So even if you shoot down the U2, sorry, pilot, but we already sent the data up to our birds in the sky. And the other thing, notice is the little insect picture there. Even though the U2 dates back more than 65 years on its original design from 1955, all of the electronics on board have been retrofitted with glass, what they call glass cockpit. So all the latest technologies are available to the U2S. All these surveillance stuff. And it turns out that because the SR-71 is not in business anymore, they fly the U2S as a multi-generational, multimodal warfare plane. So if you ever hear about our joint strike force has 4th, 5th, and 6th generation fighters in it. The radio communication and relay of all the reconnaissance data, you think takes place on things like the U-2 Hawkeye and things like that, but they fly too low. Our fighters fly higher than that. So you want something that has all the latest information, but doesn't have the transit delay of having to wait for it to go up to a satellite and then back down, because most of our satellites are geostationary. You want something that can relay the reconnaissance data lower, that can hang around the warfare area. And that's apparently the new role of the U2S Dragon Lady. They're the central reconnaissance communications hub for multi-generational, multimodal, and multimodal means planes and ships and drones and all that stuff. So the U2 is officially now the hub of our multi-generational, multimodal warfare. Who knew? They don't publish this stuff. You have to go looking. No, I did not have to crack any back doors to find this stuff. You just have to look. Oh, by the way, they can jam satellites. So when this U2 was flying around the balloon doing its reconnaissance, they were probably picking up the radio frequency for the satellite and jamming it. So once again, we used another educational experience, the shooting down of the balloon. Somebody estimated that the balloon itself costs, with all the electronics hanging off of it, maybe $200,000 to $250,000 in US dollars. Cheap. How much did it cost us to shoot it down? A few $1,000,000. Because we didn't just send up a F-22 and shoot her down. We didn't just, shoot it down with guns. We shot it down with a missile. The missile alone costs more than the balloon and the helium that was in it. Because we shot our latest AIM-9 sidewinder at it. But we turned off the ordnance payload. So it was just a giant pin that we fired through and through the balloon, because we found out from other exercises that if you have a helium-filled balloon and you shoot it with 50 caliber rounds, the rounds just go through the balloon and make little holes. And because the balloon is under pressure at altitude, the rubber seals over. So your hole the balloon descends a little bit, seals it over, and then goes back up. So you've got to poke a giant hole in the balloon, which is what it did. And the white powder that you see, that's the essentially talcum powder they put on the outside of these balloons, because think about it, when your balloon is just a giant balloon of polyethylene thin plastic. You don't want the plastic sticking to the plastic on the ground as you fill it up. So the polyethylene is coated in basically talcum powder. And as you fill it up, it expands out and doesn't stick to itself. But the talcum powder is all still there, and due to static electricity, it sticks to the outside of the balloon. So if you collapse the balloon, you get this giant puff of white powder from all the talcum on the outside of the balloon. Interesting stuff that you learn. So we had 2 F-22 fighters. The name of the mission was Frank, in honor of Frank Luke, the balloon buster from World War I. He destroyed 19 reconnaissance balloons in World War I. So Chris Lato's Lato Files did a whole background on Frank Luke and the Luke Air Force Base and the call sign used for it and what the 2 F-22s were called. They were called Frank 1 was the aggressor and his wingman was called Frank 2. Yeah. They also had 2 F-15 fighters that didn't get names. They were just F-15 1 and 2. They were referred to as Eagle Support. So if something happened, like there was an explosion on board the balloon and it took out the 2 F-22s, or the F-22s for whatever reason had a problem and couldn't get to the altitude or couldn't take out the balloon, the F-15s, 2 of them, were backup. Now you've got 4 gas-gulping, supersonic flying aircraft flying around this balloon and making multiple passes because they're flying way faster than the balloon. So you need a refueling tanker. But for redundancy, you need 2. So they had 2 KC-130 refueling tankers to just keep those hungry supersonic flying aircraft topped off. But now you need something to gather all that data because you've got these jets flying around this balloon gathering data, radio and imagery and stuff. So you need something that will collect all that stuff for relay up to the geostationary national defense satellites so they can send it back down to the NSA and the CIA and all those good folks. So they had another aircraft called an RC-130, a reconnaissance version of a KC-130. So it was doing all the SIGINT. Plus, somewhere out there, they had a pair of Dragon Ladies flying around. So I've got to believe that just since this is a mission exercise to test all the hardware you got, I've got to believe that there was 1 or 2 classified mission RQ-4 Global Hawks flying around at 70,000 feet plus above the balloon. But that's just the stuff flying around. What about the stuff in the ocean? Well, we're out in the Atlantic. We've got to have ships. So we had the USS Carter Hall and the USNS Pathfinder. Now, what's the difference between a USS and a USNS? Navy terminology for what branch of the Navy this ship is related to. But we'll get into that. And since we had to patrol the South Carolina coast because we had to shut down boating and flyovers by civilian and commercial aircraft, probably had a lot of Coast Guard out there watching the shoreline. Plus, the Coast Guard was probably there should any of the debris drift to the beachfront so they could run some rubber rafts out there and quickly pick it up before the curious general public went, "Looky what I found." And the FAA had to do ground stops at multiple airports. These are called NOTAMs. This is to inform commercial pilots and civilian pilots, do not fly into these areas at these altitudes because you might inadvertently be shot down. So during the little fracas that the U.S. military was having offshore of Charleston, South Carolina, and Myrtle Beach, the FAA was making sure that none of those civilians flew in the combat area. And that gets more important to today's, how did we bring this thing down? This is everything we did for one balloon. I got as much detail as I could get out of it. As I said, you can't shoot it with a cannon and just poke holes. Won't make it come down. The F-22 fighter ceiling is 65,000 feet. The balloon takedown altitude was 64,000 feet. Remember, the balloon flew over the continental U.S. at 70,000 feet. So they would have to shoot up at the balloon. So they waited until the balloon had descended within the range of the F-22. The balloon was flying at 110 miles an hour. The jets were screaming by at the slowest speed they could go, which was 184 miles per hour. So even at their slowest speed, with all their gear hanging out, they were still going much faster than the balloon. So when it shot down the balloon, it was flying probably subsonic, but still very fast. And opened the pod bay doors, Hal. It opened the pod bay doors because it's a stealthy plane. Had the missile pop out, ignite, launch, and they closed the doors, and then they peeled off in case the balloon had anything that would go boom on board. So they flied a Block 2 variant of an AIM-9X sidewinder. The missile is solid fueled, so you don't have to worry about atmosphere. The missile can actually fly higher than the aircraft. It was the Block 2 9X is one of the newer ones. Not only does it support infrared, it supports colder infrared, which is basically a way of saying it can lock on to not just hot, but inverse to hot, colder things in the daylight. So it probably locked onto the shape of the balloon, not its true infrared heat signature, almost its daytime infrared cold signature. The missile has a range of 20 miles. They took it out at a range of 5 miles, so easy, as they call it, a standoff target. As I said, the missile's ordnance was not fused, not armed, so it didn't explode upon hitting the balloon. It was just a giant, large diameter dart going through the balloon. The fact that the balloon collapses and produces that giant puff of talcum powder makes it look like the balloon exploded. It didn't. Because the balloon could no longer offer any lift and gravity was pulling down on the ordnance pack on the payload, it actually jerked itself loose from the balloon. I don't know if it was intended to do that, but it did. The payload separated. So now we have multiple things we have to pick up. And no, if you've seen the videos on the internet, no, they did not put a red balloon decal on the F-22 that shot down the balloon. That was photoshopped on. Because they downed it at such an altitude, that let the debris that was still in the Gulf Stream, in the jet stream disperse. So it created a 1 square mile area in 50 feet of water that they had to go pick up debris out of. Everybody's seen these two pictures probably. This is them. Looky, we got a balloon. That's not the electronics package. That's just the polyethylene balloon itself, which was in shreds. And the framework, the superstructure that was on the bottom of it that held the cross truss. So the USS Carter Hall, their responsibility was categorization of the recovered debris. So the little boats would go out there, get some debris, bring it back to the Carter Hall, and the Carter Hall would go, yep, that's the polyethylene balloon. Or, that looks like a metal strut. Hey, that looks like some electronics. Too bad it's all, coated in salt water and rusted up as a result of that. The USNS Pathfinder, that's a naval submarine looking for kind of ship of the Navy. And what it does is multispectral ocean floor scanning. So it has what is known as side-looking radar, sonar, and radar, that it creates a wide beam of sound that scans the ocean floor, and they were looking for small debris that they could then send down an unmanned bathyscaphe to grab the debris and pull it back up. But since it's debris over a square mile, there's a lot of stuff they have to scan for, and a lot of it being off the coast of South Carolina, Myrtle Beach and Charleston, is probably old shipwreck stuff, metal. They'll probably find a lot of cannons. So they're going to scan the seafloor. That's what's taking a little longer. All of the debris is being sent to an FBI processing lab in Quantico, Virginia. Notice, not a CIA lab, not an NSA lab, because it was stuff they picked up in U.S. territorial area. So it has to go to FBI counterintelligence processing lab in Quantico. So once they figure out what they've got, then they'll let the other intelligence agencies know, or they'll have them watching over their shoulder. They'll also be looking at all the data they collected, not only from the flybys of the F-22s, but also the reconnaissance they did with the U-2s. And if there's any metal that they cannot recover, but that they can image that's still sitting on the bottom of the ocean floor, they'll take that information and look at it as well. Any uplink stuff that the U-2 might have captured, they'll pick up that data and take a look at it for what kind of modulation techniques they're using, what frequencies they're using. And then aspects of the takedown being over the ocean is, I one time lost one of my little drones in my neighbor's swimming pool, which had chlorine in it. Not even by the end of the same day, all the printed circuit board copper had been corroded. So it might make it a little harder being in salt water, which is sodium chloride, as in chlorine, that would basically degrade printed circuit boards and computer chips. But apparently Quantico is already sharing, and we're making this a very proud statement, that we're already sharing what we've learned about the Chinese reconnaissance balloon with 40 other nations. And like I said, the rumor has it that there was a self-destruct package on board that didn't go off because apparently it didn't get the satellite signal. But if you can shoot it down over dry land at a lower altitude and it comes down all in one piece, that would have been good. What to do next time? This was my recommendations. Obviously, they didn't take my recommendations. But as soon as we notice that it's heading towards U.S. airspace, let everybody know. Joint Chiefs informs the President. The President informs the State Department, which should advise the United Nations Security Council that has Russia and China as members on board it. We should file a complaint with the United Nations Security Council for unauthorized trespass over sovereign national airspace. If we did that, be like, yeah, well, you did file the paperwork. They did fly in your space. So shooting it down would have been under international guidance. Don't have to get anybody's approval. The rules are already the rules. If in the process of filing the trespass, we said, we don't know, could have been like World War II when things that go boom could have been attached to it. And you can cite the Japanese World War II balloons that could have gone boom. Meanwhile, the president requests surveillance of it, and we can then deal with it inside the 12-mile limit. And here's an aircraft that, much like the SR-71, that, oh yeah, those have all been discontinued. Here's something that you may not be aware of. The U.S. military created an aircraft called the X-47B/C. It originally came out as the B, they improved it to the C. It's an unmanned aircraft that can fly on undisclosed altitude, but my guess is it can fly at least as high as the SR-71 could. And it has all the radio surveillance equivalent of a U-2. It can talk to satellites. It can talk to stuff on the ground. There's nobody on board. It's fully autonomous, and it's stealthy. I thought, well, since this thing is, notice it's an X-47B, and it's stealthy, that means it has hidden bomb doors on the bottom, you could fly above the balloon. And since this thing has enormous wings, you can fly much slower, so you can loiter or linger over the area. You fly over the balloon and you drop our own payload package on top of the balloon, which includes essentially glue, gecko, stick to balloon kind of material with very lightweight electronics that would jam any signals going to the balloon, and have a piercer and a parachute. The piercer isn't meant to pop the balloon. It's meant to slowly release the helium, which is under pressure at the top of the balloon, out of the balloon. So now the balloon, instead of having to be shot down and destroy its payload, you can have a parachute up there on top of the balloon. You release the helium until it gets close to the ground, and then you can rip the balloon and have all the remaining helium come out, open the parachute, and now the payload, fully intact, descends to the ground for complete recovery. That's the way you do it. No gun rounds, no missiles, no potential for self-destruct. It doesn't land in the water. It doesn't crash land on the ground, and complete recovery. If this were our approach to taking them out, other nations, China, would think twice, because not only do we stop them when we want to stop them, we have complete recover of whatever they were sending, and we stop them from sending because we jam the signal. So my 2 cents worth, but what the heck do I know? That's what I would have done. Hey, DARPA, do some work. So what did we do? So on Thursday, we spotted another one. Maybe another one, maybe not another one. So on Thursday, we spotted a high altitude unidentified aerial object. It's one of them UAPs. It's an unidentified aerial phenomenon that we used to call UFOs. So it wasn't identified as a balloon. And they were saying it might have been a smaller balloon or a drone. And we had to shoot this one down because it couldn't navigate. The first balloon, we thought it could steer itself a little bit. So it had the ability to avoid civilian aircraft. This one was really into the jet stream and had no ability to control its flight path, so had to take it down. And when you hear them say things like, it was a threat to commercial aviation because it was at 40,000 feet. How many commercial aircraft do you know fly at 40,000 feet? Transatlantic and Trans-Pacific are the only ones that do that. Everything else is 35 to 37,000 feet, because flying higher uses more fuel for the kinds of planes and jets and engines. So they'd never fly at 40,000 feet. So the hoopla over, we had to shoot it down because it was at 40,000 feet and endangered civilian aircraft. Now I think it's more a matter of, hey, 40,000 is a lot lower than that 65,000 that we shot the last one down at. Much easier. Let's just tell people. Okay, fine. Where was it at? It was over the north slope of Alaska. For those that have been over the years paying attention, the north slope of Alaska is where's all that good natural gas and good crude oil. So maybe this was just a surveillance balloon that was really a reconnaissance balloon looking for deposits of oil and natural gas. And, they don't put markings on the outside and say, this one's from China. So the U.S. government will only state that it was a high altitude, unidentified civilian aviation threat. So the U.S. president authorized the U.S. Air Force to shoot down the UAP should it enter the 12-mile limit. It's in the jet stream. Wait a couple of hours. It'll enter the 12-mile limit. We can shoot it down now. We got the green light. So rather than go it alone, and for all the political capital you can gain from it, the president did discuss this with, there's a thing called the SASC, the Senate Armed Services Committee. This is a committee, part of U.S. Congress, the Senate, that does the military side of things, not the budgeting, but the programs part of the military. So the president contacted as they describe him, he's not that junior, but he's the senator from Alaska that's been in office the shorter period of time than Senator McCluskey. So he's Junior Senator Dan Sullivan, Republican of Alaska. He's on the Senate Armed Services Committee. He was briefed and he approved. Yeah, shoot it down. Fine. And since the next country over was Canada, and it might get into Canada if we don't shoot it down, the president asked the Prime Minister of Canada, should we shoot this thing down? Sure, why not? It's over your country, not mine. And you're going to shoot it down before it gets to my country. Okay. So the UAP entered U.S. airspace. The U.S. Air Force shot it down, and there was a media free-for-all afterwards. The Department of Defense, that's the guy in the uniform, Air Force, multiple star general, the National Security Council, that's the guy in the upper right, and the White House, press secretary made comments, and then later on, the president made some comments. And then the two guys down at the bottom, the one on the left is Senator Dan Sullivan, and the one on the right is Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada. So you got all the right people playing the game. So this was the response to the one in Alaska. Some people might find this part of it interesting. Where the balloon was. It was flying offshore of Dead Horse, Alaska. That's kind of towards the eastern side of the north slope of Alaska. So if it was looking to do observations of the oil and natural gas areas, it had already flown over that stuff. The red polygon down at the bottom, when the FAA issued a NOTAM, this is a FAA temporary no-fly zone. I actually looked up the 4 coordinates for the corners of it and where you shouldn't be flying in this area. And they issued a temporary no flight for this zone. This zone was 10 miles wide and 8 miles across. And it was only surface to 10,000 feet. How high was the balloon flying at? 40,000 feet. But the ceiling of the NOTAM was only 10,000 feet. Why didn't they make it at least, no ceiling or 50,000 feet or whatever? Because 10,000 feet, if you have an international overflight over Alaska, they're going to be flying at 30 to 40,000 feet over this area, but your NOTAM is only good to 10,000 feet. That didn't make sense to me. They used 2 Air Force F22s out of Elmendorf Richardson Base, 600 miles to the south of where the balloon was. Due to the afterburner use, which their Air Force pilots, of course, got to use the afterburner, plus the round trip distance, plus a couple of flybys to linger, the 2 planes likely needed, F-16 backups they didn't tell you about, plus 2 in-flight refueling tankers because you're going to need the fuel. And they probably flew the tankers up halfway to the north slope so they could refuel them on the way back. So Friday at 1:45 p.m. Eastern time, they shot the balloon down. Sorry, not balloon, it was a UAP. They shot the UAP down again with an AIM-9X at 40,000 feet. And the Air Force spokesman was very clear to avoid saying the word balloon and avoid saying the word China. It was a high altitude, unidentified aerial object. So I just bagged it as it's a UAP. But he did say it was smaller than the previous balloon with no apparent ability to maneuver. But then he identified it as potentially a drone. A drone would have the ability to maneuver. A meteorological balloon would not. So maybe this is a meteorological balloon. Don't know. Might even be a private balloon. A big corporate entity up there is called Conoco. That's the oil and natural gas folks, Conoco. They not only are so big up there, they fly their own air service between Anchorage and Prudhomme Bay. So apparently now all you need is presidential approval to have the U.S. Air Force take action within the continental U.S. to shoot something down. UFOs, be advised. If you have to be a flying saucer, they're now fair game. So if one of these Tic Tacs happen to be flying around and we think it's a threat to aviation, we now have the authority to shoot it down because we've got proven episodes. So next thing you're going to hear is something getting shot down. But does it only work at 40,000 feet? Because remember, the NOTAM was at 10,000 feet. So if 35,000 feet, you happen to have one of these UAP thingies you want to shoot down and you didn't catch it when it's still at high altitude, does that mean the president can now issue a command to the U.S. Air Force to take it out at 35,000 feet, but have the FAA issue a NOTAM and then have some dumb pilot venture into the area and get shot down, or some international overflight that didn't pay attention to the US FAA NOTAM and flew over anyway? If it falls below typical civilian altitude and it's flying over an area where there's a lot of flights like Prudhomme Bay, what if we shoot down something we shouldn't shoot down? Well, we got all the right approvals. I'll be curious to see what happens there. If you remember, there was a Iranian shoot down of a flight. It was a civilian flight over the Middle East, and that was because they thought it was another country. Turned out it was another country, just civilian airliner. And today we have to add another one. So this one was flying over Canada. So if you take the one that was flying over Deadhorse and you let it go a little longer, it flies into this very narrow north end area called the Yukon Territory in Canada. And since that be Canada, you got to call the Canadian Prime Minister. So NORAD picked this thing up and talked to the Canadian, send it back to the U.S. The U.S. contacted the Canadian Prime Minister by way of the U.S. President, and the Canadian Prime Minister said, "Mr. U.S. President, if you would be so kindly as to have your U.S. Air Force go shoot that thing down." And the U.S. President went, "Okie dokie." So we did another big-time dispatch of several $1 million worth of warfare equipment, and we shot down another UAP. But I couldn't find a lot of details on this one. And I even looked at the FAA's NOTAM website, which they're supposed to publicly list all temporary no-fly areas. There was not one. That was a little curious. So I was looking in the NOTAM database, and there are lots of NOTAMs for things over Canada. When all of a sudden the U.S. military is doing joint exercises with Canada, yeah, they list NOTAMs up, and you better stay on the ground because we're going to be flying supersonic jets up here in Canada. So, yeah, there's a history of NOTAMs in Canada. There was not one. And there are NOTAMs for Yukon Territory. There was not one. So the Canadian Prime Minister was off doing another photo op for Canadian healthcare, and he opened the mic up to have people asking questions. And, he thanked the U.S. government and the U.S. Air Force for shooting down this thing and protecting Canadian air sovereignty. I thought that was very clever. But if we keep this up, but we got all the right approvals, we're going to shoot down something that we shouldn't have shot down. Hopefully there will be no loss of life, but they're getting a bit frisky with this stuff. What the hell do I know? Here's my actual thoughts on the subject. High altitude balloons have been around for a long time. They've been used for research for a long time, both commercial and governmental, and they've been used for surveillance. And even the US government has its own Department of Defense reconnaissance balloons for the NSA and the CIA. So long as they're not carrying aggressive military payloads like bombs or guns or missiles, or we detect radiation hazard or biohazards, then if we can jam them, what is the harm? The harm is we're letting the bad guys win. Yeah. But if we can shoot them down, they can shoot us down. So the next thing we might hear about is that dirigible looking thing gets shot down over, I don't know, Iran, put on the news media by Iran. And then somebody in the media will go, we didn't know about this stuff. Well, it's on public websites if you want to look. Or, the opposing party in the political discourse of the US will go, how dare you do this and not let us know? I'm sure that in a private clandestine committee of the Senate Armed Service Committee, yeah, they helped to approve and task that balloon's mission over Iran. So, yeah, negative PR. And if it turns out that the US hawks that keep saying, shoot this stuff down, suddenly we get shot down, it will stop our surveillance clandestine programs in other countries. So it will, through their hawkish attitude, create a blind eye for the US. Somebody's got to do it. And if we're no longer allowed to do it because we're getting shot down when we previously weren't getting shot down, all because we suddenly, for political gain, started shooting them down. As someone once said, adversarial diplomacy is chess, not checkers. Learn the game, and until you get good at it, just watch quietly from the sidelines. Accidental shoot down of an international commercial airliner is not worth the friskiness of this aggression. And let's say a Tic Tac comes into sight, and the president goes, you got a green light. And then we shoot down a Tic Tac and we find out, oh, sorry, our bad. It's actually a US CIA spy craft with advanced technology that you weren't supposed to know about the innards of. I doubt that it's going to be China, Russia, or North Korea. It's more likely it's going to be us, a black project that you weren't supposed to know about, but now that you shot it down, it's going to be all over the media. My 2 cents worth. And in conclusion, as you can tell, I've had a lot of fun doing this. Researching all the history, getting as much detail as I can from these, and whatever the military capabilities are, dispelling lots of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, good old FUD, and misinformation. The goal of the FUD is be afraid, be very afraid. So somebody who doesn't know anything about all this history and technology and clandestine stuff, living out in the middle of the US goes, I saw the balloon, it was flying over my house, it was taking pictures of our family when we were out in the pool. No, they aren't. But if that keeps you awake at night or makes you vote a certain way, their mission was accomplished. But there's definitely a crossover between the technology of balloons, using them for research purposes, and then using them for espionage, and maybe even using them for offense. When they're used for research, most people don't know about them and don't care about them, although I find it interesting, like the telescopes we loft over Antarctica. When it's used for espionage or offensive purposes, and there's no media hyped FUD, you don't know about it, you don't care about it. But when the media hypes it, oh, you should be concerned. What I see is people get concerned when they're ignorant about things. What you don't know may not hurt you, but it can certainly change your opinion. The U.S. is an elected representative republic. We have a legislative and executive branch whose members are elected democratically by the people that can vote. I prefer to let those people make these judgments rather than exert any political pressure on them to do something that will later be dumb. They administer organizations that have many career-trained people designed to analyze and appropriately respond to these things. So when you hear about, they flew over us 3 times before and once before, and we didn't do nothing because there was nothing to do. But now that it's all hyped in the media, we got to do something, guys. Shoot it down. They have access to reconnaissance capabilities that I'm unaware of. Like, who knew the U-2 had a bump on the top of it that could communicate with satellites? Now I know. They can also cross-coordinate with all kinds of agencies and governments that I don't have any access to those communication lines, but they do. You know, they can do diplomacy between the U.S. and the UN Security Council, the strategic committees within Congress, and leaders of other nations. Like, I don't just, call up Trudeau as the Prime Minister of Canada and say, "Are you going to shoot that thing down?" I'm just not in that loop. There's also the agencies of the U.S. government that are designed to handle intelligence and counterintelligence, like the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the National Security Agency, plus probably dozens of other ones that I don't recognize their acronyms. And then as the actual muscle arm, you have the U.S. military, all the branches of it. We now have a Space Force. What if it gets up too high? We've got to shoot it down with rockets that we launch from the ground that can take it down, take it out, whatever. They know about all that stuff. They have the approvals to expend the millions of dollars it'll take to use those things. And they're probably also aware of the black projects that I don't know about, like that UAV that can fly higher than an F-22. Teach it how to drop a package on top of the balloon and slowly descend the balloon, and now we get the entire package without any damage. My 2 cents worth. And then lots of links to lots of stuff. The best way to find out about military things, be it missiles or aircraft, is to go to the manufacturer's website and just look it up. And you can find stats and specifications and all kinds of stuff. And I found out that this is a little known fact. When they were building the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, and they wanted to find out what will it do in actual combat. People don't realize this, but when they say Joint Strike Fighter, the joint was more than just U.S. branches of military. It was international partners as well. So the EU and Israel, amongst others, have their own F-35s. We were going to sell F-35s of the inferior variety, like the first generation, to all these other countries and make buku money off of them, but we would still have the superior version of the F-35. So we came out with the F-35 Lightning Model 2. You know who has an F-35 Lightning Model 2 that's superior to the US's? Israel. It's called the F-35I. I as in Israel. Because of the stuff they do over in the Middle East that's beyond what we would normally do, they added their own software, reconnaissance, and offensive packages to our best F-35. And we thought, hey, we get all the information back. And we did most of it, but some of it Israel classified as, nope, even the US doesn't have access to some of that software. Turnabout's apparently not fair play. So what was the first encounter that the F-35 Lightning II did in warfare? It was by the Israeli version, the F-35I. They were the first ones to actually engage a target and use bombs, and they judged the precision of the bombs. The problem was the bombs they dropped were modified by Israel, so we don't know if our bombs will be as accurate as the bombs Israel actually dropped. So they were the first ones to exercise the F-35 Lightning II in combat, not the US. This stuff you learn. And that's it. So any comments or questions while we're still recording?
No, thank you. It was great.
Was that too much information or just the right amount?
A little bit too much.
Okay.
Well, I guess that
I thought it was great.
people who are looking for some of the information, like get a little bit more interested, this is an excellent guide to look for more stuff. So
Yeah.
it's pretty good.
Yeah, I used my two ex-Air Force fighter pilot YouTubers. Chris Lato's one of them.
Yes.
Mark Warden's the other one. And the guy that I found on YouTube that is a former Air Force pilot, and he flew F-22s, but he flew F-22s in the early days of them before they improved them. And you can tell he's a jet jockey, just like in his attitude. And him I take with a huge block, not a grain of salt, but a huge block of salt, because he has his own little fighter simulator system that's in his YouTube videos. And I'm going to show you how it's done. And he'll do fighter simulations and firing missiles and dropping bombs, but it's simulated by him. So take it with a grain of salt. And I'll respond to the chat items here. Where over the ocean made sense, as in if it's within 12 miles of the U.S. shoreline, that's U.S. waters. So we are safe to use that as a military protective zone. Had they gotten beyond 12 miles within the 200-mile zone around the U.S., that would have been a commercial zone, not a military zone. So it was important for us to take it down within the 12-mile limit. Now, we took it down, the one off of South Carolina, in the Atlantic Ocean, 12 miles. Actually, we took it down 6 miles off the coast, and it actually drifted just shy of the 12-mile limit. So yeah, that one was a touch and go. But the one we shot down over Alaska, that one actually fell into the ocean, but that part of the bay is currently frozen. So you think we had a better recovery because it landed not in salt water. No, it landed on hard ice. So yeah, I'm not sure the recovery would be any better. I still think the better approach is teach the UAV to drop a little package on top of the balloon and slowly let the helium out so you can descend the balloon safely. And then if you need the parachute, it's available. I would not have shot down any of these three. Us not shooting down the previous 4 didn't seem to have jeopardized any of our military secrets to the point where we just used them as surveillance education targets, which means we have the ability to jam them. So even if they get information, if we can recover their digital storage, or heaven forbid, their film canisters, and then look at the information and go, well, their cameras aren't that good after all, or their infrared is not helium cooled, therefore they can't see underground. So our missile silos are safe. If they just want to spot the latitude, longitude of the missile silos, hell, they could do that from Google Earth. So I wouldn't have shot down any of these 3, but I'm sure in political campaign circles it looks really good. Okay.
That was super. I loved it.
Stop sharing.
Yeah, that was really great, Monroe. Thank you.
You're very welcome. It was fun, as I said.
Sorry, I'm not participating very much because Saturdays are killing me.
I know. Okay. Anything to say for recording before I stop recording?